Hi, my name's Tony Baltes, and I own TigerEye Design LLC, which is a company that produces items, imprinted items, and shirts, hats, clothing, posters, things like that. But it all started 50 years ago when I made my first button. And I had a little company called All Sports Photo that in Toledo, Ohio, and I was taking Little League pictures. And hockey at 4 o'clock in the morning, because that's when they could get ice time, basketball, and some of the parents were asking for, besides pictures of their kids, they wanted buttons. So I bought a little badge-a-minute button machine, and it was one of the god-awful thing God ever created when it comes to buttons. You could make probably 1 out of 2 buttons without messing it up. It cost $25, which is why I bought it. Might even have got it on sale for $18 at the time. And they made these things so everybody would get it. Everybody would try it. And the real trick to their thing was that they made a part. The parts that go into these buttons were an odd size. They were not standard 2 1/4, they were 2 3/8. And so you couldn't buy parts from anybody else except their company that would fit into that machine. And it was one of the all-time great hustles, because the parts probably the equivalent of 10 cents. Parts from other companies back then were probably 4 or 5 cents, but you had to use badge a minute to work in their machine. And I learned quickly. I mean, I made more bad buttons and swore more because you had to make them over again, particularly when you were putting photos on buttons. That seemed to be a trick. So that's how I started. Somebody asked me to make a button, and I remember distinctly, I believe it was a hockey mother said, well, we get buttons from our other guy, well, you do it. Of course, being the competitor that I am, I bought a button machine. And 50 years later, I'm looking back on what's happened with those buttons. There's been a series of companies. The 2 main ones after All Sport Photo was a thing called Creative Photographs, which basically we did photos on buttons only, and then after that was TigerEye Design. I started that in 1994 in Versailles, Ohio. Prior to that, I did all my work in Toledo. And actually, as I think about it, what even got me into photography was a job I had working for Gulf Oil in southwestern Wyoming, actually out of a town called Baggs, Wyoming, 80 miles from the closest town. And I went out there with a degree in earth science, thinking that I could be a geologist of some sort. And I got to tell you, I was probably the worst piss-poor geologist, so I ended up being a roughneck. I made a lot more money. It was more in my bailiwick. I don't even know why I took classes to be a geologist. It kept me eligible to play football at the University of Toledo. I still to this day, I think I wasted 4 years of college, but here I am. So when I was working as a roughneck out there, I rented a cabin in Dixon, Wyoming, which is right down the road from Baggs. And I rented it from a lady named Sevilla Noyes. And she was probably in her 80s then, close to it. And this would have been in the early 70s. So I rented a cabin from her, and it was an interesting place. This Dixon, Wyoming probably had 60 people in it, but they had Mrs. Noyes' house, which was a 2-story, really nice house. And she, as I learned, she was the first nurse in Wyoming, and she she married a guy named Edwin F. Noyes, who was the first doctor in Wyoming. He's a fellow that was from New York. He got tuberculosis, went out west for healthier times, and was the doctor in the area. He was a doctor for Butch Cassidy and the Hole in the Wall gang. and there was about a 30-year difference between Sevilla and her husband, but they had some kids, and she was the nurse, and from what I understood from the people around there, she probably was the midwife for 90% of the births around there. And the Butch Cassidy story was interesting. I remember in 71 or 72, whenever the movie came out, I drove Sevilla 80 miles to Craig, Colorado to watch the movie. And she watched it and said, "That's bullshit. I knew Butch Cassidy up until 1930. He did not kill himself down there in Bolivia or wherever it was." And she showed me letters and things from him that were just fascinating. And lately I've seen some documentaries that's probably is what happened. He was real smart. He made a lot of money robbing banks, didn't want to be chased anymore, went down there, faked his death, and people like Mrs. Noyes knew him. And kind of a rural place there. I think their first paved road was in 1930 or 1940. And before that it was a dirt track. But the interesting thing about Mrs. Noyes and the location was right across this dusty track from my cabin outside her house was a branch of the Wyoming Library. And you could go there once a week and give them a list of books that you wanted, and they'd have them for you. I read everything, and one of the things that I got fascinated with was photography. Never had taken a picture other than an Instamatic camera. 35 millimeter was a mystery machine that I would never learn how to run. And so I didn't have anything else to do out there. I bought the camera and started taking pictures. Well, I was sending my film off. They had the rolls of film back then, and Mrs. Noyes, I went to her and said, "You have an extra bathroom in your house. May I use it as a dark room?" So I converted it to a dark room, developed my film, printed black and white pictures, learned how to do that, and I actually got published in I think it was called the Little Snake River Gazette newspaper that printed some pictures that I took of either cows or horses or rodeos or something, and I really fell in love with it. So I knew I wasn't going to be a roughneck forever, because either you get hurt or killed eventually. So I went back to Toledo, started a photography business, shooting pictures and with Little League teams. There were some weddings mixed in and some other things, but mostly that's what I did. I teamed up with a guy named Larry Loff, who together we started a photo lab where we would develop our own prints and print our own pictures. And Larry was more into that. He was doing the big prints for architects and things like that, and I'd bring in my sports things. And I started making buttons. I had the idea to put a team picture on a button, like a whole team, a Little League team, and really some experiments that didn't work well. But I remember the first team button that we did. There was the University of Toledo basketball team, and I think it says on there 1976-77. I don't know if I have any of those yet, but what we did was it had a picture of the basketball team that was, I think, maybe an 8x10, took an X-Acto knife and cut out the picture. And then we actually used, we put it on a white piece of paper and actually used an ink pen to darken in the background so it was blue. Then we used press-on letters that would said whatever Toledo basketball, and we turned it into a 3.5-inch button, because that's what a good size button to put a team on. And we just thought we were cooking then, because we sold some. The team bought them. I think their parents or whatever, but it was a team button, and it was full color. Up to that point in time, the color wasn't an easy thing to get. Sports Illustrated would have a full color cover, and half the pictures were black and white. It was 4-color process printing. Well, we were doing that shortcut with photography. So we started, we I started soliciting business from high school teams, college teams, and the way we would make them, we'd still cut those pictures out with a X-Acto knife, and then lay it on the color background we wanted to film. We didn't color it in with pens anymore, and we used rub-on letters. And that got to be quite the business, because then we would take a picture of that artwork and then print on a 5-inch roll of photo paper. We would print the pictures, and I made a little machine that had a bomb sight on it that we'd run that roll of photo paper through there, and you'd sight it up, and you'd hit a foot pedal, and it would cut the button out. So in a box at the bottom of that cutter, you'd have a whole stack of 3.5-inch photos that could then be made into buttons, and that said Kodak on the back. That got to be real popular. We did between, I'd say, 77 and probably 81. In 1981, we probably did 3,000 or 4,000 different teams from around the country. Most of them were high school, some were college, and it became a real popular deal. Colleges were buying them, the athletic departments, and selling them. And then we ran into an NCAA rule at that time that said you couldn't profit from the image of a player, even a team player. Now that's since been changed, but back then I still got a letter somewhere from the NCAA that says, okay, we can't stop you from making it, but we can find the schools who buy from you. So it really put a quash on it. So it went back to high schools then. But yeah, we did things when Michael Jordan was a freshman in North Carolina, I think in 81. A lot of pro players played college ball, and it got to be a big deal. But we had to stop. So later, we ended up getting a license with Major League Baseball, basketball, and football. And there you get licensed, and it was legal, and we did team pictures and individual pictures, things like that. But back to the photography, or the buttons that we're making photography, I will say back then, I really wasn't aware of the political world. I didn't know the difference between Republican, Democrat. I didn't vote probably till I was, maybe 30 years old. But I knew that there was a market for different things. So I read in 1980, Reagan won the presidency. And okay, that was cool. But then I read about the crowds that were expected in Washington D.C. for his inauguration. I mean, I guess I kind of knew there were inaugurations before that, but this is the first one I became aware of. So Larry and I made one design button. It was a 3.5-inch button, full color. It said Ronald Reagan, Inauguration Day, January 21st, 1981. And I made, 700-800 buttons maybe, and I put them in a big duffel bag, and I hitchhiked to Washington, D.C. to sell them. I didn't have a clue except there was going to be people there, and I had buttons, and I was going to sell them. Very interesting trip there to D.C. Got good rides there. Once I got there, I had a friend there. I could sleep on their couch. And so I took my bag of buttons, and I noticed that there were other people selling buttons out there, and they would have big pieces of cardboard, and they'd pin them on them, and people would come by. And my idea was to, I had a used army coat that had all kind of pockets in it, and as my brother-in-law loaned it to me. My job, I thought I was going to pin them all in this coat and walk around and have people say, hey, those are cool buttons, how much are they? That didn't work. So I got a board, went up, set up, got arrested within 30 minutes because I didn't have a license. Had to go get a license. So all I remember about getting that license, two things. One, it was next to a Chinese place called Big Wong's. I always remember Big Wong that was the location where you got your license. The second thing is that I met a fellow named Maurice Millard, who basically looked like a street rag picker. But he was well-spoken, good man, and he saw my buttons. We were in line together to get licenses. He said, "I'm going to buy some of those from you. Those are great buttons." I said, "No, I got to sell them myself." Well, he turned out to be a guy who would set a table up along the street, and he had a license, and he sold fruit, bananas and oranges and apples and peanuts, I think. And he did a really good business. He'd been doing it for years. And it turned out that I think he was Sugar Ray Leonard's father-in-law, or he was associated with them. I'm not sure what the relationship was. I didn't find that out till later. So I bid him goodwill, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to be up on 16th Street during the inauguration. I have a spot on the parade route, and if you want a place to sell those buttons, come and sell them with my fruit." And I said, okay. That was going to be the next day. And so I went out and sold. And I remember standing by the reflecting pool near the Capitol building, and I had my board up there, and I hear a voice behind me, "How much are your buttons?" And I turned around and said, "Are you Moses?" That was my big line. And it turned out it was Charlton Heston, who was a button collector of some sort, and he was a Reagan fan. So he came up, and I don't know where he came from, come up behind me, and he started laughing. He said, "Yes, I'm Moses." And of course, I'm trying to be big conversationalist, like stuttering. And he said, "How much are your buttons?" And I said, $2 each, 3 for $5. And he goes, "Oh, you're selling, you should raise your prices. Those are the nicest buttons I've seen in D.C. He said, "They're color. Not many people had color buttons. In fact, hardly any." So, of course, he bought a few buttons, and of course I immediately raised the price from $3 each, 2 for $5. And I'm still selling them. People are selling during the day. And I was still buzzing because Charlton Heston actually knew who I was. He asked me my name. So the upshot of that is I had some buttons left for the next day, and so I went down to Maurice's stand and said, "Can I sell them here?" So I started selling them. Well, there were some guys from New York that had uglier buttons, obviously, because we were killing the business. And they stood in front of me. I moved. They stood in front of me, and let's just say there was an altercation. And I'd like to say I was winning, but I think I was getting the hell beat out of me. And the cops came on. This was an hour before the inaugural parade started. Paddy wagon came up, threw us all in the paddy wagon. They didn't care because there was a disturbance. I'm sitting in the paddy wagon, and Maurice points at the cop and says, "Not that one."